We live in an age of political polarization and preference bubbles, of economic change, rising threats, and a rapidly changing world. Canada needs to stay relevant. We need more smart conversations. We need to dive into critical issues and big ideas with passion and unrestrained optimism. I'm Erin O'Toole. Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast.
Welcome to Blue Skies. We are living in interesting times, as that old proverb goes. We're days after Liberation Day from President Trump, more like Hibernation Day, hiding from the benefits of mutual defense and security, global trade, the incredible prosperity, the incredible liberty that we've seen in the post-World War II rules-based order. That seems to be crashing down, and I can't think of a better Canadian to talk to about all of these things than our next guest. And this is one of the first times Blue Skies has been joined by a guest for the second time. And that just shows how in such high regard I hold him and what a great Canadian he is. Admiral Mark Norman was raised in Kingston and is a graduate of Queen's University, what I like to call the second best university in Kingston. And Mark's father was the commandant of RNC before I went there. So he literally for his whole life was either part of a military family as a kid or in a military family himself, serving as he did for 39 years in the Royal Canadian Navy and in the Canadian Armed Forces, retiring in 2019 after having served with distinction as the 34th Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy and as the Vice Chief of Defense Staff, the number 2 person in our Canadian Armed Forces. You may know Admiral Norman from the Admiral Mark Norman affair, related to a ship contract, the Davie Shipyard, to which he was vindicated after having been maligned by his own government. But one thing that never changed, even through those hard times, was the great character, principle, and fortitude that Mark Norman showed. And that was understood by many Canadians because 3,547 men and women from across the country contributed to his legal defense fund. And the government spent over $1.4 million prosecuting someone that they ended up apologizing for. So he came up looking not only principled, but came up looking victorious against a government that never should have challenged him in the first place. He's now a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a great Canadian. Mark Norman, welcome back to Blue Skies.
Erin, thank you. It's humbling. I'm literally choking back a few tears here as you introduce me. Thank you, good friend, shipmate, and I'm really pleased to join you at what is, as you described, a pretty crazy time. Who would have imagined we'd be where we are today in March of 2025 or April of 2025? Yeah,
100%. Well, listen, I want to share one personal story that I don't think I ever told you how much it meant. When I was Veterans Minister, I was told through a friend about a veteran who was a proud Navy veteran who was struggling. He had had addiction issues and was really going through a bad period. And I saw you at a reception and told you about this veteran. And you sent over a care package full of Navy swag and a little note. And I don't know if you remember that, but those little gestures, despite running our Navy, a country with 3 oceans, the most coastline in the world, you took time for a veteran. And I thought that is the type of character we love seeing in our leaders. So I don't know if you remember that story, but it's always stuck with me to show the type of character you have, Mark. And speaking of character, the first person to get elbows up in Canada was you. On February 14th, you wrote probably the toughest, strongest op-ed I've seen in the National Post in years, entitled, "Canada's Relationship with the United States Can't Be Saved." Under that, it says, "We are under attack and must act accordingly." Wow, as someone who's a Legion of Merit member from the U.S., giving you that as a senior Canadian military leader, what led you to write that op-ed?
well, it was a pretty. I was intentionally provocative, but I really felt compelled to say something for a couple reasons. One, I thought that for the most part, systemically and institutionally, we were kind of asleep at the wheel in some respects. and there's a variety of things that were contributing to that. It wasn't just one view. And the other concern that I had was that we were at a pivotal moment where the relationship was fundamentally changing, whether we had seen all the pennies drop or not. And it's not. This is the problem, and we find it even today. It's not about the individual relationships or even the institutional relationships that we know are solid on a personal level, on a cultural and societal level. It's the more foundational structural issues of not just the administration, and I've said this publicly, it's those around the administration and their now clear indication that they are in the process of resetting not just their own internal affairs, but how they tend to operate on the global stage. And you know, how I came to that conclusion at that moment in time would take longer than we have, but I really felt compelled to say something. And in fact, what happened was I tweeted something, which is always a quick and easy way to communicate something, and then the Post reached out to me and said, "Hey, wow, could you elaborate?" And so, you know me, given any opportunity to elaborate, I'll take it. So I did. That's how it all happened. Yeah.
Well, now I'm making you elaborate even more because we're going to have a long for discussion about that sentiment. Because, as I said, this was February 14th, so it was kind of your Valentine for for our friends to the south, who, of course, we love and we've both served alongside. And
Right.
we know most of the rank and file in the U.S. military do not feel the same way as their commander in chief. But when you're saying we're under attack and we need to act accordingly, are we ready to decouple from joint defense of North America, national defense of our own country? Um, is NATO doomed? And you meant to be provocative with that title, but are you really worried that this is going to be Canada alone for the next few decades?
I am concerned that that is a possible scenario that we cannot discount, and that we shouldn't diminish the possibility of. And I characterized as being a potential orphan in this rapidly evolving global security framework that we're seeing play out. And so I still think it is a real concern. We're seeing this play out, you know, day after day, and there's little bit more information and a few more indicators and warning, as you and I would refer to in our military lives, as to how this might play out. And to your question about, the defense of Canada, we've always traditionally, for the vast majority of the life of Canada, and certainly for the 20th century, our mantra, our philosophy has been that the best way to defend ourselves is being aligned with partners who we can trust and who we're prepared to fight alongside. And of course, before the United States, it was Britain under our colonial arrangement with them. But the idea being that, okay, we never really felt we were going to be alone, that we needed to think about ourselves as being alone, and and that we would always be in some sort of a relationship. And yes, the relationships have historically been disproportionate. Um, so where we find ourselves now, to your question, is in a place where um, we we have not made the necessary investments, decisions, and priorities to set ourselves up for even a modest capacity to actually defend ourselves, um, because of the reliance, either an alliance reliance, pun intended, or the relationship with the United States. And of course, you can't ignore the geography of the circumstance. And so, you asked the question, can we? Well, maybe, maybe not, but we sure as hell can't do it if we keep behaving the way we are. And
Yeah.
what our closest ally is telling us, they're not going to do it for us. And so, and then of course he's communicated a similar message to our European friends and allies, and basically, cut them loose, in that context. And so they are, they're closing the circle, circling the wagons, whatever analogy you want to use. And it's unclear, how Canada can or should, fit into whatever those new structures are. I believe that there will continue to be some sort of NATO framework. I don't see that, even if the United States did unilaterally withdraw, which has, there's issues there, positive and negative. Um, there's still going to be the other 31 countries, that are going to want to be in some sort of alliance, and whether Canada wants to be there or not, some sort of NATO minus. I,
Yeah.
I don't want to pretend exactly what it's going to look like, but there's going to be some sort of security framework. And I don't, the issue here fundamentally is I don't see a scenario where we're going to be, defended in a military context by European allies.
Yeah.
So I don't see an Article 5 scenario, if we want to use that kind of language, where the United States would choose to invade us. I'm still not convinced that that is likely. It's possible, um, but and then but we're into a different, being under attack, as you know, doesn't mean necessarily it's a traditional military kinetic activity. We're under
Yeah.
psychological attack,
Yeah.
we're under emotional attack, we're under economic attack. That was the essence of what I was trying
Yeah.
to say.
No, you were being provocative, and certainly the aggression we're seeing, economic aggression, trying to impact us, has a form of not warfare to it, but sort of a hostile position from a traditional rival. I was listening recently to a great podcast, Northern Sentinels podcast, Cressayot does, and he had Stu Beer on it, and they were talking about Canada's problem was we, other than during Afghanistan, which we kitted ourselves up for proper warfighting capability, we've gone down to really just a military that had been ready for international peace and security operations and not really for national defense, and certainly not for warfighting. And that probably comes from the fact that starting in 1940 with the Ogdensburg Agreement, we did throw our national defense for Canada into a union of sorts with the United States, that permanent joint board of defense and shared procurement, and that grew into NORAD and, of course, NATO. But if that's all changing, our posture, we were set up almost as a client state for a larger standing military in the United States. What will we really need to do to be strong and independent and able to guide our own way? Because you had a great op-ed a month later, so you had the elbows up and were under attack. Then you had one in the National Post, and I recommend people looking into these, in March, where you kind of said we've got to get ready for a period of isolation, and in that isolation we have to be self-reliant. What can we do with a military that's not set up to be self-reliant at this point? And is 2%, is 3%, is 4% enough to really have the posture to defend this country?
Yeah, so there's a couple of elements to your question. You know, the, there will be, a limit to how much we can actually afford. And the problem with that conversation is that it's often opinion or ideologically driven. Okay, but the reality is, to your point, we have not done enough, and as a result, we have um, the incomplete and arguably ineffective armed forces that we have. It's not a wholesale, general, admonishment of the great people that are there and some of the
Mm-hmm.
capabilities that are there. The reality is, um, it, it is a force that has evolved over decades of risk management decision making. It is not a force by design. And so we find ourselves in a place where, okay, what is it exactly that we would need to do to actually defend our own country? And for everything from the things that you would understand, but your listeners are just, surveillance, knowing what's going on in your own territory or your own approaches, be they airspace, space, or maritime. um, then having the capacity to respond in a autonomous and sovereign way. And by autonomous, I don't mean unmanned. I mean, we have
On our own.
we have the political autonomy to decide what it is we're going to do and where we're going to do it in our own territory. And we don't have those capabilities. Very, very limited um, um, capabilities in those regards. And so, the one of the key issues that's playing out right now, we see it in the public domain, is the notion of technical or industrial dependence. And you know the somebody gave me the disentanglement of this. It's first of all, it's not easy, and it's there's a lot of risk, and arguably, there is some you know there's some places that you just wouldn't be able to go in a reasonable time frame. So I think how is, in the simplest terms possible, I those things that we have and need now, or that we need and still have now, we're going to have to use as the basis of the force in being. As we move forward in a hopefully accelerated and much more robust way, more and faster, we have to start to um, look for non-US technical solutions to a lot of these things. And
Hmm.
it's not just the technology, not just the ones and zeros, the coding, and all the issues around classification that I know you understand. It's also the industrial linkages. And we will never be able to ignore the geography that defines us. But I think we can be much more diversified, if you want to use a
Yeah.
business term. And the other thing, and this is really important, we have enormous potential in this country to do a lot of things really, really well. We do many things really, really well. We can't do everything as it relates to defense and security and in industrial capacity and technology, but oh my God, we have we've not only underinvested, but we have underappreciated our own capacities, and in some respects, either culturally, from a policy perspective, whatever, we've been self-defeatist in many ways. And
Hmm.
I think this has got to be part of the whole recalculation of how we go forward. We
Yeah.
can do a lot more. We are capable of standing on our own 2 feet much more than we give ourselves credit for. I mean, just look at some of the amazing things that the country did in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Um, and
Well,
that,
let's look on that. I agree, because people forget that we weren't ready in the interwar period between World War One, World War Two. We have this bad habit of putting tools down and doing nothing. But by the end of World War Two, we were, I think, the third largest navy. We were the fourth largest air force in the world. We were the third nation in space, the second or third to have controlled nuclear fission. We can do a lot, and as you said, autonomous, that self-reliance. I'm working right now and speaking with CG, that great International Governance Institute, um, on having a conference on sovereign capability. What can we do ourselves? We've got a Telesat out there. Should we be relying on that and not Mr. Musk's whims with SpaceX? I think you've already seen Doug Ford canceling a contract there. So, with this incredible potential, because we were free traders, because we had great alliances, or so we thought, we didn't always need to rely on and build up this expertise. But now is a bit of a time. Um, So as we're talking about that and decoupling, to your point that our relationship can't be saved, or your fear that it can't be saved with the United States, I was in France when Jason Kenney tweeted out a picture of a Rafale fighter jet and started talking about not buying F-35s. Well, now there's been 3 or 4 countries talk like that. We also have a contract to acquire the P-8 aircraft from Boeing. These are great companies that we've had long relationships with. But should everything be on the table here, Mark, in your view? And I've been critical on Twitter myself about I don't hear some of the senior executives who are also veterans speaking up for Canada and the NATO alliance at a time the president is diminishing those alliances. So should we be willing to walk away from those contracts and even say, look, if we have to get a 4th-generation fighter and not a 5th, but do that in partnership with allies, Canada's prepared to do that. Do you support us putting everything on the table like that?
I do. And not because I presuppose an outcome. And that's where that's where there is some nuance to this. I think it is important because the conversations, if they're done properly, will force us to look at things differently in the context that you have described in your last couple of questions here or comments. And absent those sort of focusing or catalyzing events, it tends to become a bit of a theoretical academic conversation as opposed to a really pragmatic conversation. If you take, you mentioned, at P8, F-35, I have my own views, not so much on the technology themselves, but on what they represent in this current context. And, and I realize that these are emotive issues, and I realize that they're also hugely pragmatic issues. And so, I just unpack them from the perspective of why we need to talk about them, not because I think we should or shouldn't cancel one or the other. I think it's important that we signal to the Americans that, okay, you're basically telling us the rules have changed. Fine. We're telling you that if the rules have changed, the rules have changed. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
let's just put you on notice here. We're not going to be impulsive or childish
Emotional.
about
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Exactly. But fine, but we need to look at it. And I'm encouraged that at least we're prepared to have those conversations. And why I think it's important is because of the very things that you've laid out. And, there's issues here that you can't uncouple some of the economic issues associated with this. We are a partner, which isn't just about the buying, as you know, it's
Mm-hmm.
also about the production, the engineering, the manufacturing of componentry and all that kind of stuff. So, there's that component to it. There is a technological component to this with respect to reliability, access, you know, um, uh, at what point does our ability to actually use the aircraft to its full potential become constrained? Can we live with that? Those kinds of things. The flip side of that is how much sovereign control do we have over the evolution of the capabilities of that particular weapon system or platform?
Mm-hmm.
And this is I am publicly on the record as saying we need to look at these things. It applies as much to the combat management system of the new River class destroyers as it does to the F-35. The
Mm-hmm.
P-8 to me is a perfect example of how we got ourselves into a situation where we convinced ourselves that the only way out of it was a sole source acquisition through foreign military sales to the United States, because there were some compelling arguments. However, if we had actually, going back to your first, sort of setup for this, if we'd actually been behaving strategically a while ago, pick a time, 10 years ago, we could have we could have come up with a Canadian solution. based on a proven aircraft, which is one of the arguments that's been used as to why the one we bought was the right one. Well, okay, there's lots of proven aircraft out there based on a proven, we'll call it mission suite in the back of the aircraft, which is arguably one of the best in the world, designed and integrated in Canada using Canadian intellectual property. See where I'm going with these
Yeah.
things?
Yeah.
They all come together, but uh, the decision of the moment was urgency trumps strategic behavior, and so we end up with another one of these things where we have to decide, are we going to do it or not? And
Yeah.
and the alternative, the last thing I wanted to say was the problem with these conversations is because we've made the decisions, the alternatives are not as easy as we thought. So,
Yeah.
you know, everybody's having similar concerns, and this is what happened. Your viewers will appreciate this because they lived through it. This is exactly what happened during COVID. Well, we didn't have access to PPE. We didn't have this. We couldn't do this. So the next thing
Vaccines.
you
Yeah.
know, vaccines, all this stuff. So we are either in a bidding war or we end up on a waiting list. Neither of
Yeah.
those are behaviors conducive to a country that is acting in a strategic fashion. And so you're going to cancel something. Well, you better have a solution in in your back pocket, and the reality is we don't. So this is why I believe we go with what we have now, and as we move forward we start to look at alternative solutions. And I'm a huge proponent of, if we have Canadian capacity, Canadian competency, and intellectual property, what the hell are we doing? Why are we not harnessing that for our own purposes, and potentially maybe somebody else wants it elsewhere in the world?
Yeah. No, and even Prime Minister Carney mentioned, quickly sole source something to Australia, the Jordan system,
Right.
when really are there options? We've got great technology in Canada, and I'm sure you're on the same page as me. I'd rather see the approaches to the Northwest Passage covered by surface and subsurface monitoring, subsea cables, radars, than over the horizon. We've got to at least control and know who's in our shipping lanes. And that's going to segue perfectly to my next topic, which is the wider issue of sovereignty. You started out, we started out talking about your op-ed and Canada's under attack, or that sense we are. The early years of our country, Canada was created as a bulwark against manifest destiny, which now seems to be back. And the early militia structure of our military at the time had, I think it was called Plan One, which was how to defend against the U.S. And we had Athenian raids and a few little things in the history of Canada. But from a sovereignty perspective, um, our coastline, our Arctic, which people like yourself, myself, been talking to for many years, are we in the position to adequately patrol, defend, and assert our sovereignty in whether the Northwest Passage or any of the Arctic archipelago?
No. And I mean, I'm being quite stark in my assessment. The reality is no. We don't have sufficient surveillance capacity. We don't have enough platforms of various types, whether they fly, float, swim, are in space, whatever. It doesn't matter. We don't have enough of them. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have the connections, the digital connectivity necessary to pull it all together. Um, and then and we don't have the logistics footprint necessary to support any kind of sustainable um, uh, projection of force inside our own territory, or to the extent of our territorial claims. Because remember, as you know, our territory extends both in airspace and in maritime space beyond the physical boundaries
Mm-hmm.
of what we think of as Canada. And so, no, the answer, but here's the thing. The uh, and this goes back. Why? Well, we don't have to beat that to death, but the reality is that over our adult lifetimes, and even before, we had this assumption that the problems for Canada's physical security were elsewhere, and our best defense was to partner with our friends and allies elsewhere to stop the problems from coming here. Okay, that's basically so. Every decision made, either in a decision of omission or commission, doesn't matter. We allowed ourselves to get into a place where that was not only the mindset, but it also became the toolbox, that was available to even recent governments, because that's all we had done. The reality is that the problems facing Canada are no longer elsewhere, and now we have to figure out, to the essence of your question, how do we protect the longest coastline in the world and the second largest landmass in the world? That is,
Hmm.
by the way, bordering on two superpowers, one of whom we have traditionally thought to be a potential enemy, and the other of whom wants to annex us. So, and used to be our best friend. So,
Yes.
so this is a hell of a strategic circumstance to find yourself in. But that's where we are.
Yeah.
Um, and the encouraging thing is we're having some of the right conversations. You know, can
Yeah.
you remember in your lifetime when legitimate issues of around the defense of Canada were actually key elements of three political parties in Canada? No, uh, and we have, to not trivialize the situation, we have the two leading contenders for the leadership of Canada arguing about who's going to spend more faster.
Yeah.
Um, this is unimaginable.
Gosh, I was in politics at the wrong time. The media used to roll their eyes when I started talking, when I would talk about the need for Canada to spend at least 2% of our GDP on defense. Now you're seeing, as you said, three parties with credible platforms. I think
Sort
the
of,
conserv
yeah.
yeah, sort of. The conservatives and the liberals are both putting it up. But let's talk a little bit about and link this back to the Mark Norman affair, if we could. When we made the decision as a government to convert a vessel and make the asterisks in the Davie shipyard, it was because Canada did not have the ability to have a supply at sea, a replenishment at sea, and a supply ship capability. So we acquired, in an expedited fashion, a stopgap as we were waiting for the larger vessels to be constructed. Now, that shipyard, Davy, just acquired a Finnish ice breaking shipyard and is proposing the Ice Pact, a hub of ice breaking expertise in the Quebec City region, in Lévis, that could build ice breaking capacity for both the Canada, United States, and Finland. That's using our domestic capability and becoming a world leader in this ability. Has that made you feel a bit of vindication? Because all you were trying to do the whole time was to make sure that your Navy had that supply ship. I
Yeah.
want to hear your thoughts on that and where Davy is today, because that's domestic capability,
Yeah, well,
sovereign capability.
okay, so I don't, honestly, I don't dwell on it very much, but I don't dwell on the historical part, the recent
Yeah,
history, on that much. But um, there are moments when I think to myself, I kind of roll my eyes and say, well, okay, um, you know, when we look at the schedules and the timelines and how long things were supposed to have taken versus how long they have taken, yeah, I think one of my observations on this would be that, um, it only seems that when we get ourselves into a crisis that we're prepared to look outside of the box in
yeah,
terms of possible solutions. And if we're not in a national crisis now, I mean, that was a very specific single capability crisis that had it had huge implications, as you said. But now we're looking at a whole macro level system of systems, and it's kind of like, okay, like, are we gonna, we can't continue to repeat the same behavior over and over again, and as the saying goes, and expect a different outcome. As far as industrial capacity, shipbuilding specifically, those kinds of things. Um, we Canada is now where we wanted Canada to be 10 to
10 years
15
ago.
years
Yeah.
ago, right?
Yeah.
Where we needed Canada to be 10 or 15 years ago. As I say to people regularly, you can't compress time. So don't think you can. We're now where we wanted to be. The question is, what the hell are we going to do with it?
Yeah.
We have capacity. We have I'm going to call them partners. Canada, not only are they, we have partners now in our ecosystem that are they're not only willing, but they're capable to do what we need them to do. And so the question becomes, where is this advantageous to Canada? Where could this be advantageous to Canada's interests, which include our relationships? Sure, there's a lot of bluster and rhetoric out of Washington right now, but at the end of the day, the Americans, how even though they're bigger and they're stronger and they have more money and resilience and all these kinds of things, they've got themselves into a similar problem. They have divested of a number of national capacities that are now huge vulnerabilities for them, and one of
Hmm.
those is shipbuilding.
Yeah.
And so, we can help, we should help. But I think right now, the best way we help is by sorting out our own backyard,
Yeah.
literally. And so, it's encouraging to see that we're initiating some programs. I think that those should be, they're the start of what should be bigger and broader programs. There is still unrealized capacity in Canada in many domains, but you're asking specifically about shipbuilding. I think we can do more. If we can figure out quickly some of the lessons that we've learned in a very unpleasant way over the last decade or so and apply them, we can probably um, be much smarter at figuring out what the next bound of this could look like. And
Yeah. Well, now, thanks to the National Shipbuilding Program and your interventions, we now have three world-class shipyards that have seen hundreds of millions of dollars of capital, private capital investment in them. Um, we just can't go from feast to famine in terms of building things, or these things will slow down, we'll lose the skill sets. And as I used to say in relation to Davy, Chantier Davy, if we lose a shipyard or we lose the capability to make satellites or something, as the world changes and becomes dark and uncertain, it's hard to recreate that capability from
right.
scratch. And so that's a strategic uh, um, benefit to having these things.
And again, I take your viewers back to, although it's a completely different, the you've made an excellent comparison. Go back to their experience living through COVID and
Yeah,
beyond the issues of, personal constraint and the medical issues and everything else. What were some of the key takeaways about that?
yeah,
Supply chains, sovereign capability, resilience.
yeah.
These things, these are lessons time immemorial, and I agree with you completely. And when you, it's a hell of a lot harder to rebuild something after you've decided to get rid of it than it is to keep something. This is what's
That's
playing
right.
out. You get me going on a rant. This is why we have still not bought a single round of artillery ammunition
I
in
know.
Canada. And I know, I'm assuming that your viewers are paying attention. This is absolutely, it's both incomprehensible and irresponsible. I mean,
Absolutely.
because I mean, and then we get into arguments about, well, industry want guarantees. Well, of course they want. It's entirely legitimate that they would say, because look at our track record. So
Yeah.
you want me to do this for how long? Oh,
Yeah.
well, maybe a year or two. Get lost. No, no, no private equity or any kind of corporate entity would make those sorts of short-term decisions. They wouldn't.
Yeah.
And so why would we expect them to? Anyway, that's a whole
Well,
other
and as you said,
bag of
Canada's
snakes.
Canada's reputation. I flew on the Sea King. How did that Sea King EH 101 go? How did our submarine projects go? How did the F-35? Mr. Trudeau was going to cancel that. The Asterix itself, the Liberals tried to cancel that. So industry needs certainty, and they need the ability to have a partner, a funding partner, so that they can make the capital investment as the shipyards did to build this capacity. And speaking of ships, surface and subsurface, um, the Arctic submarines. Just before the election, the Liberals had made several announcements with respect to potentially acquiring 12 submarines. Diesel submarines will not be in the AUKUS nuclear game. But talk a little bit about the importance of a submarine for Arctic sovereignty, and how, as polar routes are opening up, including the Northwest Passage, which in the first Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo walked away from the traditional approach that Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney had forged, that the U.S. would give a courtesy acknowledgement when they transited through the Northwest Passage. We view it as internal waters, they view it as international waters. Talk about how you use a submarine and the importance of an asset like that for our domestic security and sovereignty.
Right. So lots in there, and as you appreciate. Let me just for people watching, let me just make a distinction here right at the outset between why you want submarines versus what you can do with submarines, because I think that's a really important distinction. And the conversation often goes to, well, you do this, and submarines can do lots of really cool things, as you and I both know, and we can talk about them. But the reason why you have a submarine is because the submarine is the only platform, manned or unmanned, that operates inside the water column. Now, for the folks who don't know what that means, we tend to look at water from the surface perspective, but you need to imagine your Canada's maritime state, what in three dimensions. So it goes from the surface of the water down to the
Seabed.
bottom of the ocean, right? The
Yeah.
seabed. And so you can put sensors on the seabed. You can make sensors that float, either they're stationary or they can move. And you can put things on the surface. And you can put aircraft, as you well know, above the surface that can penetrate the surface with sensors and monitor what's going on in the water. But the only thing that operates in the water is the submarine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so why you need submarines is to be in the water column for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason is because other submarines are in the water column.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost elegant in its simplicity. That's why you need them. And then, so why is this important? Well, as you've pointed out, we look at Canada differently than Canada is geographically structured. We're surrounded on three sides by water, and in particular, our northern approaches are extremely contested from a legal and national sovereignty perspective. They are increasingly active from both a military and non-military activity perspective. They are a traditional hiding place an operating area of both friendly and unfriendly submarines. Um, and so if you want to, we go back to the earlier part of the conversation. If you want to know what's going on in your own territory or territorial waters, and you want to be able to do something about it in the context of knowing what's going on inside your own water space, you've got to have sensors that can listen to what's going on in the water space, and you've got to have some sort of mechanism to respond. Um, you know, and the analogy is this is no different than having an aerospace defense structure that doesn't have fighters. The fighters are in the airspace. They're there to react. They're there to deter. That they can do a bunch of, see, it's the same analogy, right? They can do a bunch of things. They can shoot things down if you have to. They can go up and flip the bird at somebody if that's what you want done. Whatever it is, there's a physical response, and that creates a reaction on the part of an adversary. The
Mm-hmm.
only way you can do that in water space effectively is the submarine. The other thing is there's only two ways to keep people out of your own waters with absolute certainty. You mine it
Yeah.
or you put submarines in it.
Yeah.
Because any other potentially opposing force has to take absolutely astronomical asymmetric efforts to either avoid that water altogether because they don't want to be threatened and go through a minefield or to have to deal with a submarine, or they have to put all these resources into um, clearing the
Protecting it.
mines
Yeah.
or finding the submarine.
Yeah.
And I hope that is a
No.
simple description. And as it relates to the North and the ice and all of this stuff, we don't need to be under the ice for extended periods of time like you see in the movies.
Yeah.
Because there are other ways. We have to look at this as a system of systems. So you can put, which we're not doing effectively at the moment, but we can put together a much more robust network of sensors on the seabed or that can get into the
Yeah.
water column. And then the submarines both contribute to that sensor system, but they become the deterrent and the reaction platform if it's necessary to do something.
Yeah. No, as you said, it's a critical capability for our Navy and for the country with the most coastline. And as you said, there are other submarines up there, and because we don't have sufficient coverage, um, other countries, including more hostile players like Russia or even China, don't assume that there is a Canadian submarine there. So it gives them more liberty to act. So
Because they know three of them, three of them are in some degree of maintenance, and one of them is out, in Vancouver Harbor, which is great, but
yeah,
it's not how you deter the Chinese from operating in the vicinity of the Arctic archipelago. For
yep,
for example, if that was
yep.
something that you wanted to do, right?
Well, and that's why let's just talk about the capability then for a minute. As you said, you don't need to go under the ice cap to really patrol the approaches to the Northwest Passage and to make sure that deterrent factor is there. So right now, the request for expressions of interest is designing a program for Canada that looks like 12 would be the number they're going to try and get. That it would be the ports would be Esquimalt and Halifax as it is. So a big component will be the ability to transit, because if you're doing the north, and I know the military want a patrol of 21 days on patrol in the Arctic, but from those ports, you're going to have a heck of a transit to get up
That's right.
to, say, the Western or the Eastern Arctic. Talk a little bit about that, because, we don't have our Arctic bases. Once they leave Esquimalt, that is a long and challenging sail in some cases up to the Northwest Passage from Vancouver Island.
Right, or even farther north, because most Canadians don't realize that we talk a lot about the Northwest Passage, but in terms of the archipelago, it kind of goes through the middle of it.
Yeah,
From a archipelagic perspective, there's still a lot more Arctic north of it,
yeah,
like like probably 1,500 kilometers farther
more.
north.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and so, yes, a couple of really important issues which, apply to the submarine and maritime domain problem, but they apply to other things as well. The distances are vast, and therefore the capabilities that we need in our inventory have to be able to cover those distances reliably and, in essence, on their own. Okay, now, um, we come back to what that means in a minute. 21 days on patrol means that's 21 days in your patrol area. And if your patrol area is, in the approaches to the eastern approaches to the passages you described, or in the Barents Sea, or wherever the hell you want it to be, you got to get there and back. And submarines don't go very fast, as you know. So this
hmm
is a lot. So basically, that means you got to have massive endurance, which in even in 2025, I'm sorry, means you got to carry fuel. Now, conventional submarines are actually hybrids. Think of them like the Toyota Prius
hmm
of naval systems, but they are quite economical, but they go fairly slowly. So you're looking at several days to get there, stay up there, and several days to come back. They got to carry everything they need. It's like going into the woods when you're
yeah.
camping. There's no corner store to pick stuff up. You got to take what you need. Oh, and you got to bring it back. And so these are real considerations, and so they start to drive the kinds of submarines that are fit for purpose. They're going to have to be larger. They're going to have more robust powertrains. They're going to have reasonable sea keeping, which means they're not going to bounce around in rough conditions. They are going to have some sort of ice strengthening, but this is like discussing, how strong is an icebreaker? Well, it is
Yeah,
whatever you want it to be, that kind of thing, right?
there's degrees.
But you also touched on a couple other things. We're going to have to do a better job in terms of infrastructure in the north. And we've made some attempts to do that. Um, I'm not sure that's the right answer. Going back to your question and about the interim oiler capability. Well, one of the innovative aspects of that is it was a leased capability. We didn't buy it,
hmm
and it's this obsession about having dedicated military capabilities for everything is in my mind completely unnecessary, and it drives
Yeah,
us down. It drives us down to solutions that are not necessarily the right solution. I think we have to partner better with established in commercial and industrial mining infrastructure that's already up there, and have those kinds of partnerships. We're going to have to be able to, as you know from your life, there's such a thing called submarine tenders, which are vessels that are specifically designed to support submarines. So you don't have to bring the submarine home all the time, for minor things, including fuel potentially, maybe some basic supplies. So we need a more sophisticated understanding of our footprint from an infrastructure perspective, and what are the enablers that are required to sustain the capability. Um, in the Canadian, because our Canadian discussion space is so immature in many respects, we tend to focus on the objects. I call them the big shiny objects, and we don't understand what all of the constituent elements are that actually enable the big shiny object to do what you want it to do.
yeah,
And that's why programs often come off the rails, because we don't pay the right attention, or people assumed that, well, aren't we just buying a big shiny object? Well, if that's all you're buying, then how the hell are you going to look? All these
Yeah.
other issues,
Yeah.
which is which in my mind is how we can responsibly deliver the capabilities necessary for Canada. And I am convinced if we did that properly, we'd be well over 2% of
Yep.
GDP, without even breaking a sweat. The problem is we're trying, we look at things through the wrong lens. That's the first problem. And the second problem is now we're in this urgent, I don't want to call it a panic, but this urgent need to spend money quickly to demonstrate that we're spending money, and that's absolutely the wrong answer.
Yep. Yep. Well, and we've got to be more innovative. So as you said,
Right.
so there could be private partners leasing the asterisks, gave us more options, gave us more capabilities. And so perhaps rather than Canadian Armed Forces trying to be all things to all people at all times, there's ways to forge some of these partnerships. And this is going to lead to the last topic I want to talk about, which is um, also an example that we may need some outsourcing or private sector partnerships to do this sovereignty and to do national defense properly is some of the personnel challenges facing the Canadian Armed Forces and cultural challenges. Uh, the the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy now, Angus Topsea, a great officer, someone I went to RMC with, um, was quite stark last year when he talked about how proud he was in the force in the Navy, but also some of the challenges they had. 30% undermanned in some parts of the Navy. The Army, similar, a lot of uh, understaffing of positions. I heard through an Air Force source that at some points we only had 50 operational fighter pilots in the Royal Canadian Air Force at any one time operationalized at a time we're supposed to be acquiring 88 uh, F 35s. And training and keeping these people is not something you can do overnight. So I'd love your thoughts on how we can tackle this recruiting crisis and a bit on this debate about the military, because I do think um, at times we've undersold the warfighting capability, the the live the adventure, the intensity that draws in a lot of young men. But if you try and make the Canadian Armed Forces just look like it's Parks Canada with sidearms, you're not going to get a lot of that sort of young men who fought wars since the dawn of time. You're then running it like any other department of the Canadian Armed Forces. And so how do we get the balance right so that there's equality of opportunity, but we're going to realize that some of these traditional sort of soldiering jobs will always have a an overabundance of the young man who wants to fight for king and country, so to speak. And are we even able to have these conversations, or will I be canceled for that for that statement that young men still want the adventure and still want to go to war for their country? How do we get through this malaise? Because clearly, the forces and military life isn't appealing to enough Gen Zs and even enough millennials.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. So that's quite a bundle to unpack there,
It
but
is, I know.
I'll do my best. First thing I would say is, um, I've come across a lot of young women that are looking for that kind of adventure too. So that's it. And
True.
I think there's a key. And I know you didn't mean it that way,
Yeah,
but we 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 need to attract 100% of the population from the outset.
100%. But Mark, we're driving away
Oh, I
some
know.
of the young men, and this is something we have to be honest about the conversation, right? And
So
so,
that part of it, what I'm going to park, I want to park the word. We're going to come back to it because you said it and it's the right word. This is all about balance. And finding balance can often be a bit of a iterative process, right?
mhm.
The people talk about the pendulum, it's swinging one way or the other, and then it eventually finds its natural point of balance. And I think that's kind of what's happening. And we talk about that. But I want to sort of start this. So we look at the problem. I look at the problem through sort of three overlapping perspectives. Okay, do we have enough, and what's the right number? There's a whole problem set right there. What is the qualitative dimension of whatever that right number is? And by that I mean, do they have the right skills? Are they properly trained? Are they ready? Are how many of, and you and I both know that not only are we not only are we short a bunch of people below the approved establishment, but there's a whole bunch of people who are in the establishment who are not available for a variety of reasons. Some of them legitimate, some of them probably questionable. So now, these are the qualitative dimensions. Do they have the right training? Are they actually competent? And I don't mean this as a judgment on the individuals themselves, but do they have the right competencies to do what's expected of them? And how do we ensure that they not only have those competencies, but they can maintain them and improve them as they go through their careers? And then there's a third component to this, which is, are they actually doing the right things? So, and I haven't even talked about the issue of the how whether they're attracted or not attracted, what attracts in one individual one versus individual two, and they want to do something that anyway that this system is not giving them. But there's a big problem here as well with what people are actually doing, and my view is we have way too many people doing things that could be done other ways.
Mm-hmm.
So back to, how do we look at this? Well, part of this is there's a whole bunch of things, and this as well as any of your military viewers know, that we have people in uniform doing a lot of things that they probably don't need to be in uniform to do. And we also have a bunch of empty holes in an organization where we need people in uniform that we can't fill. That's only one dimension of this problem. So the point is, it's a very complicated problem, but we start by, how do we fix this? Well, first of all, we have to make military service actually a desirable and attractive thing to do. And that starts with convincing Canadians at the highest level of government, i.e. the Prime Minister and ministers of the Crown, that military service is something honorable and something important and something to aspire to. And that, service to your country, yes, it can be done in many ways, shapes, and forms, but, service in the military is really something that Canadians should want to do. And the good news is, apparently there's a bunch who do. I think there should be a bunch more who should think that way. And it starts with the right, messaging, if I can put it that crudely. The second thing is, with respect to a lot of the mechanisms and machinery, and we are seeing some improvements in that regard. And then there's this qualitative dimension to why do you join the military? Well, this is why I go back to my third point. My bucket was, if you're joining the military to do anything other than fight on behalf of the nation that you serve, then why are you joining the military? And
Yeah.
we've kind of created this self-fulfilling prophecy in many respects. The good news is we do train everybody to the same standard when they come in the door. That's important. It's not just important from a standards and training perspective. It should also be important from a cultural perspective. But what we know happens is that, people will migrate to different things for a variety of different reasons. Mostly personal, it might be convenience, it might be a variety of things. So what we need is a system that is more agile in acknowledging why people would opt out of things. Because in many cases, that's what's happening. People are opting out of things. They're either opting out of the force altogether, which is sad, or they're opting out of
The pointy end of the stick.
right, the more operational things,
Yeah.
for a variety of reasons. And you know what most of those are? They're related to family and quality of life.
Yep.
So, and a sense of value, which is addressed, first of all, let's get the
Yep.
messaging right, get the balance right. And you and I both know that leadership is a huge component of making people feel good about what they do.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's a very complicated melange. I do believe that there is an opportunity now to strike while the iron is hot, so to speak.
Yeah.
That while we're fixing the intake problem, we have a throughput problem, which is the next in the sequence that people are
That's
just
another discussion. But
exactly
let me pull out what you said there, Mark. So, there has to be a we have to remind people of the great character and the respect of serving your country and putting it all on the line and service above self. There needs to be a delineation of uniformed people have to be people that are willing and prepared and ready to fight for their nation in the Army, Navy, Air Force. Um, and therefore, maybe support or other jobs don't necessarily have to be uniformed or could be another level of uniform service, and that maybe pay should should flow. And then the quality of life piece. You know, bases when you were young used to be the best gyms and quality of life, and families lived on base. It may not be able to be the same exact structure now, but we have to make sure that we take care of families better and that we have that quality of life so that when people sign up for this. So you think this needs to be a multi-layered approach to really attract people in, um, put forward a fighting military, and then make sure that people enjoy the culture and feel a part of it. And now is the time to do it. Um,
right, and give them the tools they need to actually do the jobs that they're expected to do. And I do, you're exactly well done. You took my ramblings and made them into something coherent. um, but yes, and now is the time. Back to your opening comment, when we started the conversation, things have changed, and they have changed dramatically, and now is the time to look at this, not stop what we're doing, bringing people in, and but we're only, and I don't fault anyone for this, but we're focusing on one part of a very complex equation. It's a multivariable equation, and all we're focused on right now is figuring out the value of X when there's seven other things that we have to figure out. And you can mess around with X all you want, but you're not gonna, you're not gonna fix it. But we need to fix all of it. Um,
and now is the
Otherwise,
time.
exactly.
And now is the time, as you said in that second op-ed, we could face a number of years of isolation and the need to be self-reliant. So not only fixing some of the gaps in the Canadian Armed Forces, but restoring that that honor that should go alongside serving in it. And I can't think of talking about these issues with anybody more equipped and as honorable as you, Admiral. So, Mark Norman, thank you for making a second appearance on Blue Skies. Thank you for almost 40 years of service in uniform to your country and for your continued patriotism. I really appreciate blue skying these issues with you today.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. All the best to you and your viewers.
Thank you.
Take care.